Cheers.
Cheers, Brando.
How are you today, Frank?
I'm pretty great, man. I'm excited to talk about flaws in mead.
I know.
Yeah.
Me too. Right now, we are drinking. How old is this? 3?
3-year-old batch of something sour.
Smells like floral honey, right?
It's complex. There's definitely a honey note, but there's something tart and super layered. I mean, you could definitely call it like leather and almost barnyard, but I think it's pleasant. I think it's really pleasant.
It's not a funky barnyard, it's a pleasant barnyard.
Yeah, because there's like a green apple acidity that cuts through it so that it's not just funky. It's like, alive.
Mm.
But we'll talk about these things because flaws are often flaws because there's too much of them. And I think in this mead, there are a lot of things that, if there were too much of them, could be considered flaws. But when they're right in the right balance, it's actually complex and beautiful and multi-layered and intriguing.
Yeah, it goes back to that meat stool.
The mead stool. That's right, man.
Balancing everything you got.
Alcohol, acid, honey. These being
Tannins.
Yep.
It's the fourth, right?
Tannin is, yes, an optional. Usually we just play with the alcohol, honey character, and acidity, but tannin is another potential leg on the mead stool, and you want to keep them in balance to have something rich and complex.
All right, so you got that perfectly balanced meat stool in this 3-year-old sour, but you're saying if anything's out of balance, there's a potential for what's considered a flaw.
Yeah, and some characteristics are just like bad 100% of the time, right? There's one in particular called Mercaptans, which is what happens when hydrogen sulfide like evolves into its next worst layer, which is like burnt rubber, sewer gas. It is gross. And if that's present at all, it's like, ugh, no one should have to drink this. So
it tastes like burnt tires?
Yeah.
Like rubber?
Yeah, burnt rubber.
Okay.
Not pleasant at all. So this can happen, and flaws are, chemical compounds that are produced during the fermentation and are not desired, and when they pass a certain threshold, they become very noticeable, and they're probably going to spoil your drinking experience, like your hedonistic experience, which is whether you like it or not, has a very low probability of being positive when these flaws are over the threshold
of what you measure, essentially.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in mead we haven't fully established what these thresholds are. In beer, they've been established. There was a lot of research done in the 50s and 60s by one of the big brewing companies and a research scientist that they hired. And that work laid out these foundational style guidelines that, there might be some sulfur in some German lager styles. Like that, that's often part of the characteristic. But if it's over this threshold, it becomes undesirable. And so they trained all these tasters to notice when things were there. And then they measured the beers, and then the ones that were unpleasant had a threshold that the sulfur had passed. And then the ones that were pleasant, if the sulfur was present, was under that threshold. So they established these like objective numbers of what these compounds were, and if it was over that amount, then it was considered an objective flaw.
Gotcha.
So we're kind of approaching flaws from the same perspective, that there are thresholds where they're agreeable and might be part of complexity and balance if they're under that threshold, and then if they're over that threshold, it might be undrinkable.
Is there an example that you can give on a specific flaw that, like, under a certain threshold it's complex, but over a certain threshold it's not?
Yeah. So, got my list of thresholds here, and I think that this sour mead is a great example. So, then the Siebel Institute, which is one of the top fermentation science institutes in the country, they publish a flaws kit, and so you can spike a liter of beer with this little vial of chemicals to then taste what a flawed sample tastes like.
Oh, okay, cool.
And one of the flaws in that kit is lactic acid, which is totally present in this sour. But the lactic acid in this balances with the honey notes and the alcohol and the overall composition of the mead and makes something really interesting. Whereas if it was overdone and it was like super tart and super intense and sour and all you were tasting was lactic sourness, it might not be interesting at all. It might just be unpleasant.
Gotcha.
So does that make
make
sense? Cool.
So then let's start with the big ones that you generally see in mead, because as you said, it's not really established in mead. I know you and the Mead Institute are working on making it more established.
Right.
So let's just talk about like what are the common ones that you've experienced and just kind of go down the list from there.
Yeah, I think the first one is H2S, so hydrogen disulfide, which is rotten eggs. In less intense manifestations, it's burnt matchsticks.
Okay.
But
like burnt wood almost?
like if you've ever struck a match, right, and that smell of like sulfury burning.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But rotten eggs is often where it goes, and that's often the result of a flawed fermentation where the yeast aren't getting the nutrient that they need and maybe aren't at the temperature that they want to be at. So they'll start to put off H2S to protect themselves and try to like make as beneficial a fermentation environment as they can in a fermentation environment that's not beneficial.
Gotcha. Is there a way to measure that one objectively, like with a tool, I guess?
Yeah. H2S is a panel that like someone like ETS, Analogical Testing Service, can just it's a sulfides panel, and costs $131 and takes them 2 days, and then they'll kick out your parts per million of all your different sulfides. So it's moderately advanced chemistry, and you got to have some specialized equipment to run this analysis, but when you know it, you can know what that number is, and then you can potentially look at whether it's worth trying to reduce it, because copper is like a great neutralizer of sulfur.
Okay.
Randomly enough. And there are ways to treat your mead with copper, but typically the best path is avoid sulfur production by having a healthy fermentation with the right conditions, and then you don't have to worry about how you're going to solve it or get it out.
Gotcha. So I'm just picturing people sprinkling copper into their mead.
I knew a guy who carried around a piece of copper on his keychain.
Okay.
Like it was copper ducting, or not ducting, flashing for like outside of a house. It was like a 1-inch square of copper.
Okay.
And he would like put it in meads that he suspected and wines that he suspected of being full of H2S and swish it around. And then if it tasted and smelled better afterwards, it was like, well, obviously it was H2S. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, that's kind of funny.
Yeah, I was like, you're a wizard, aren't you?
All right. So, I'm assuming you guys haven't dialed in the numbers for that test yet.
Exactly. This is going to be a bit of a project, figuring out what acceptable examples are and what unacceptable examples are, and where is that number that delineates acceptable versus unacceptable.
That makes sense. Okay.
There you go.
But ultimately, if you get like an eggy taste,
Sulfury, yeah.
eggy, sulfury taste, you're most likely dealing with that flaw.
Yeah.
And copper is one way to remedy it, but
Proper nutrition and temp control and aeration is the key way to avoid it.
is the key way to just avoid the problem completely.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. So what about the next one?
Yeah.
What do you wanna talk about?
So we're using the Siebel Institute's list of flaws, but we also have a Mead Institute list, and between the two of them, hopefully we're going to cover the majority. On the Mead Institute side, there's a lot about bacterial spoilage that I think is important. So if you have a microbe that gets into your fermentation that you didn't intend, it can have all kinds of outcomes. So like lactobacillus can produce like barnyardy flavors. It can produce sulfury flavors. It can produce, well, these are other kinds of microbial spoilage that can produce like mousiness, like mouse pee. Like if you've ever smelled the bedding of a mouse, like
Yeah, it's not pleasant.
no, but it can definitely get into a beverage if that beverage has been infected microbially. Cattiness is another one, like cat pee.
Oh, yikes.
Yep. So a way to test for these is to do a scorpions panel, where they basically take your mead, run a sample of looking for any kind of genetic material, and then compare that genetic material against a list of known genetics. And if there are things other than yeast, like alcohol, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, in that panel of DNA, then it's like, oh, it looks like you got something living in your mead that you did not intend to have living in your mead.
How does that happen?
Well, so this is where quality assurance, quality control comes in, and your process. Anytime your mead touches a surface, if that surface hasn't been cleaned and sanitized, there's a risk of some microbe growing on that surface and then getting into your liquid. And if that liquid is not stable, then there's a risk of that microbe growing and then putting out bad tasting chemicals as a byproduct of its growth and then ruining your beverage.
Gotcha. Okay. So the way to deal with like microbial flaws is to just make sure everything is clean and sanitized, that your meat is touching.
That's the number one approach.
Okay.
Yeah. If you've done a good, well, then there's also clean fermentation, because if you've got just like a slow, sluggish fermentation, your yeast haven't kicked up and like taken over the must, the mixture of honey and water, which mead is before it gets fermented, then the microbes that naturally live in honey can take over and sometimes spoil the batch as well.
Oh, interesting. So the honey itself has that potential.
Yes.
Even if you keep it all clean.
Yep.
Okay. And do the remedies for that differ depending on what the microbial infection is, or is there not great solutions?
Yeah, I mean, again, the number one defense is a great offense, right? A healthy, vigorous fermentation is gonna resolve 90% of your issues. But if you've got unclean equipment that you're using after the fermentation, that's a major risk and source of problems as well. So you've got to have healthy, clean fermentation, and then clean, sanitized processing equipment, all the way from must to bottle.
Gotcha. Okay. And is there anything else about microbial infections that you feel like you want to cover?
No, I think that, they can show up as mousiness, cattiness, animal barnyard. They can also get into cooked vegetables. So that then is DMS, which, like, if you've ever opened a can of cooked corn.
Yeah, it's not.
Yeah, you don't want your drink tasting that way.
Yeah.
So that's another microbial flaw. I know, so pleasant, huh?
Sorry, I'm just put off by that.
and then butyric and acetic are also. So acetic acid is vinegar.
Yeah.
And it's the result of acetobacter, which is carried by fruit flies typically. So fruit flies get into your fermentation, they'll convert the alcohol into acetic acid, and then you get this very sharp, vinegary,
interesting,
finished product. And then butyric is like vomit, which is another microbial spoilage flaw. So cleanliness of process, or a clean, healthy, vigorous fermentation, and then clean, sanitized equipment is a key defense against all of these flaws.
That makes sense. So what about the 10% that is hard to fight against when you're talking about the basics of sanitation and
Yeah, so 90% is a vigorous, healthy fermentation. But then that 10%, if you don't have clean, sanitized equipment, there's a very large risk of, it's like it's gonna happen. If you don't clean and sanitize your equipment, there's gonna be a biofilm that grows, and then there's gonna be microbes that grow on that biofilm that can't wait to get into a liquid where they're gonna be able to eat and reproduce. And then as a byproduct of that eating and reproduction, they're gonna put out flavors that ruin your beverage. So you've gotta clean your equipment and sanitize it.
Gotcha. So are there any flaws that happen within a brew where it's a clean fermentation, you got clean equipment, you got clean processing, and something is still tasting off? What is happening?
So, great question. Flaws that can happen as a byproduct of all the right conditions, but there's still a flaw. We have this hypothesis that there are certain honeys with certain yeasts that are incompatible. And our hypothesis is that's hydroxymethylfurfural, HMF, which is this compound that's in honey and it increases as honey ages. And we're wondering if when HMF runs through the genetics of certain yeasts, it just puts out this like bitter bite that makes mead unpleasant sometimes. And it seems that people can get used to it, but new drinkers often get very put off by it.
Okay.
So we're wondering if screening for hydroxymethylfurfural might be a way to avoid those flaws being produced and put out on the market.
And that's simply just a combination of the honey you're using and the yeast you're using is the theory behind it, right?
Right.
So what can you do to mitigate the risk of that happening? Is it just testing the honeys and the yeast together?
So that's a big deliverable that Mead Institute is hoping to put together, is understanding the role of HMF in mead production, and does it increase the risk of a less pleasing mead being produced, even though all the other conditions are ideal. So if that hypothesis is correct, that HMF is responsible for unpleasant mead, then you're going to want to reduce the presence of HMF in your honey, which means using it more fresh, or using varieties that have lower HMF content, or testing your honey before you commit to using it in your mead to make sure that the HMF level is low.
Gotcha. So there's just ways to actually measure that and to make sure it's not happening before you start the process.
Yeah. Though we want to make sure that it is the culprit before we recommend people commit to that screening step.
Gotcha.
And then there's higher alcohols, which is often the byproduct of an unhealthy fermentation as well. Like if a yeast gets hot and nutrients a little low, there's a good risk of that yeast producing fusel alcohols. So if ethanol is clean and relatively tasteless, menthanol, butanol, these other fusel alcohols that are really not meant to be consumed by humans can ruin the flavor of your beverage. So you want to mitigate or eliminate those as much as possible by having a healthy fermentation as well. There's a few other ones like metallic, which I think is kind of an equipment problem, but there are certain yeasts that can produce it as well, and you know them when you taste them. They taste like biting on a piece of aluminum foil.
Gotcha.
Or even blood, which is gnarly, like iron. Yeah. And then papery, because it's been oxidized, like cardboardy, wet cardboard. That's because at some point oxygen got introduced to the mead post 1/3 of the first third of fermentation. Prior to the first third of fermentation being complete, a little oxygen helps. Actually, a substantial amount of oxygen helps because it helps the yeast create strong cell walls when they're fermenting and therefore live to complete their fermentation. But then if you introduced oxygen after that, there's a risk of that oxygen oxidizing the beverage and turning it into this like kind of stale, cardboardy tasting product.
Gotcha. Is there a way to measure oxidation in mead or not really?
Yeah, you can measure dissolved oxygen, and that's a key step for folks that are doing distribution, is understanding how much oxygen got picked up along the way, and that at a certain amount it will result in a shorter shelf life for the beverage.
Gotcha. Okay.
And sulfites can bind out oxygen, which kind of protects against that, but then we get into the whole gut microbiome interaction with unknown antimicrobial chemical.
Yeah, that you're putting in your body, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay. And are there any other ones you wanted to talk about?
Over esterification, like if it gets too spicy, too phenolic,
Okay.
then you're dealing with typically a fermentation outside of its temperature range, and you can test for it with a fusel oils test to know which of these compounds are out of spec. But often, like, you taste it and you smell it and it's like lacquery and too much of one flavor and compound, so that it's not pleasant and subtle. It's like burns my nose, makes my body feel unhappy.
I'm picturing like a straight perfume flavor.
Yeah, like if you take clove essential oil and you would kick it up a notch beyond that.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah. Unpleasant. And then we also have acetaldehyde, which is like green apple, which is fermenting outside of the temp range of a given yeast strain. And then we also have stuff that makes buttered popcorn taste unpleasant.
Diacetyl?
Yep.
Okay.
Nailed it. There you go. Which is another temp issue. Like fermenting at the wrong temp will produce diacetyl.
Okay, so I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but let's kind of dive into like healthy fermentations and like the key pieces that prevent most of this stuff, like you're saying. I know temp is a large consideration. Aeration at the beginning is what you said, right? Am I forgetting anything else?
Temp, aeration, and nutrition.
Nutrition.
Giving the yeast the nitrogen that they need at the right times in the right forms to make the yeast healthy and able to ferment all the way through without producing off flavors.
And when it comes to so the temp of the brew, it just depends on the yeast you use, right? And the yeast usually, like, where you get the yeast will tell you what temp it should be brewed at.
Yes, the yeast has a tech sheet that should tell you the temp it should be brewed at.
And then when it comes to nutrients, what are the different nutrients people use, and like what are the pros and cons to each nutrient that you can use in mead?
Yep, so there's rehydration nutrients.
Okay.
And then there's broad spectrum nutrients.
Okay.
So rehydration nutrients are like your Go Firm, your Go Firm Plus. There's a number of brand names, but it's the nutrients you add to a dry yeast when you're waking it back up.
Gotcha.
Then broad spectrum are what you're using at the beginning of fermentation through the first third of fermentation. And there's organic and inorganic, and then blends of the two. So inorganic is DAP, diammonium phosphate.
Okay.
And that's like super intense. It often kicks the yeast performance up, but it kind of makes them overcooked.
Gotcha.
And then there's Ferment O, which is all organic, and it's just basically dead yeast cells turned into a powder that then you feed to the yeast, and then they eat it, and then they reproduce, and there's more nutrition available for them. And that's like a slower, smoother kind of approach. So you want to calculate what your target yan is. It's typically like 200 parts per million. And then what your volume of nutrient needs to be to get your must there. And basically most honey water mixes have like no yeast available nitrogen to them. So you need to add enough nutrient to get up to that 200 parts per million to make your yeast have what they need to reproduce and then ferment all the way through your fermentation.
Gotcha. And is there like calculators for that, or is that just something you have to learn from experience?
No, there's a lot of calculators for that. Yeah, there's the meadmaker.com/batch-builder, and it gets into nitrogen requirement and which nutrient regime you want to use, and then it'll kick out, based off your volume, what kind of nutrient profile you need and when to add your nutrients, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, it's a nice resource to have.
Yeah.
All right. Well, is there anything else you want to share about flaws in mead?
Yeah, I think it's an advanced topic. We just skimmed the surface, but it's a key piece to understanding quality mead and quality mead production. So Mead Institute will be doing more on it. If people have questions and want to get into specifics, we would love to dive deeper based off of your questions.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing.
Go team. Cheers.
Cheers.